And welcome back. So, was the Uvalde shooter a male supremacist? Some strange stuff here. And how does this relate to things like incels and whatnot? On the line with us is Alex DiBranco, the executive director of the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism. The website there, MS, or THEIRMS.org. He's also a Ph.D. candidate at Yale in sociology, researcher of right-wing and misogynist movements. Alex DiBranco, AlexDiBranco is Alex's Twitter handle, or THEIRMS. Alex, welcome to the program. So what's the difference between an incel and a male supremacist?
Yeah, so misogynist incel is a movement within male supremacism. Male supremacism, like white supremacism, is an overarching term that refers to a variety of structures, ideologies, and movements predicated on the belief in biological essentialism, that there's an inherent difference between males and females, that there are no other genders, and that males are superior to all others. And that superiority entitles them to dominance, control, they dehumanize others, etc. So that's male supremacism writ large. Mm-hmm. And the misogynist incel movement is a movement that has, over the past almost a decade, become more active in promoting acts of mass violence, and there being more acts of mass violence over these past years, based on ideologies around cisgender men's sexual entitlement to women's bodies. Mm-hmm. And if they don't have those, that's an injustice, and that violence is potentially one of the justified responses to that. Incels writ large is a term that goes back to the 1990s and was a gender-neutral community founded actually by a bisexual woman. But this permutation of misogynist incels has developed alongside other male supremacist groups like the Red Pill and pickup artists over the past decade.
That's fascinating. And Alex, my apologies for using the wrong pronoun in introducing you. It's entirely on me. So first of all, how big is this, and what kind of risk do these movements represent to society, and what's the connection with the Uvalde shooter to these things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's really hard to get a count on people who subscribe to these kinds of male supremacist ideologies and movements. You have between tens and hundreds of thousands of people who are members of forums organized around misogynist ideology, but many people don't subscribe to those forums. Studies that have looked at traffic, of those forums sometimes show hundreds of thousands to maybe millions. So these are various numbers. The number of attacks that has happened specifically connected to the misogynist incel movement or to related to its ideology has been more than 50 deaths over the past decade. What we see, though, in this recent shooting is that we don't actually have any evidence that the perpetrator was directly connected to a specific community or movement ideology. What he expresses in a lot of ways is just our sort of more mainstream rape culture and the male supremacism that is inherent to the structure of our society. So the things that we know about his misogyny, his threats of sexual violence and physical violence against girls and women, is something that is actually seen widely on the internet and is not only connected to any given movement. Sexual harassment, online and offline, sexual violence, interpersonal violence. The perpetrator started by attacking his grandmother. That is really commonly seen in acts of in mass shootings, regardless of the specific ideology,
Yeah, like
white
Sandy Hook.
supremacist, male supremacist, that they start with violence against a woman in their life, potentially a family member. So what we see in this shooting seems to be more coming out of mainstream male supremacism, of which similarities certainly to misogynist incel ideology with its focus on sexual entitlement, but that ideology itself is an expression, a more extreme expression, but still in line with a lot of the messaging that comes through actually our mainstream culture about dehumanizing and objectifying girls and women and around cisgender men's entitlement.
We're talking with Alex DiBranco. She's the executive director of the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism. THEIRMS.org is the website. Alex, this is something that either was very underground or largely didn't exist 20, 30, 40 years ago. I'm an old man, and I have no recollection of this when I was a kid, although obviously, rape culture and male supremacy and all that, they were just kind of baked into our culture. But organized movements, I remember the men's rights movement in the 80s, actually, or maybe the late 70s. It had a little flair for a while. How has this movement come to be, or these movements, how have they come to be organized? How have they come to be branded? How is it that people feel like they're part of a movement as opposed to just either reflecting the culture unconsciously or without realizing it, or whatever, just being a strange person? Is this a social media phenomena? Is my perception of this as being relatively recent accurate, or am I just blissfully unaware?
Yeah, so it really has to do with, what was baked into our culture and then the progress we've had around gender justice. So we can look back to the movement for women's voting rights a century ago and see male supremacist mobilizations at that time, which were very hostile, which were violent towards the women who were protesting for their rights, because that was an early major threat to cisgender men's dominance. And then when we look, as you mentioned, with the men's rights movement that started around the 1970s, but really coalesced in its ideology in the 1990s and became more active, and also perpetrated acts of violence and was a globally active movement, are coming when they feel a threat to the cisgender men's dominance and cisgender white men's dominance, of course, primarily, that they had that dominance and now they are losing parts of it. So as we go forward from the 70s, as we have new legislation around sexual harassment and sexual violence, as we have things like married women can finally have credit cards under their own names without their husband's signature. Like, so much of the progress for gender justice is just in this past half century. And then in the 1990s, things like the hearings around Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill speaking up against sexual harassment, those were touchstones for cisgender men, primarily cisgender white men, to see that they did not have as much of a hold on their dominance as previously, even though we still have a really long way to go in terms of gender justice. So it's not just a social media phenomenon, although certainly social media helps movements organize, but it is a fairly recent phenomenon that is coming through as cisgender men don't just have this structure of their dominance that feels just completely, safe and unthreatened. They start to mobilize to reinstate the privileges that they previously had, often under the banner of this being justice, but in actuality it's just seeking to reuphold the supremacist structure that was at the core of, the founding of our society.
Yeah, I totally get it. And going back thousands of years, in fact, the whole Eve myth. But Alex, we're going to hit a break here in a minute or so. I'm wondering, what can we do about this as a society, as a culture, I hear from particularly women in politics that, you stick your head up on social media, you're going to get rape threats, you're going to get death threats. Doesn't so much happen to men. Although I know of one gay man politician who's out and married and everything, and he has experienced a lot of the same kind of stuff. How do we push back against this? How do we change society?
Yeah, I mean, certainly intersecting forms of supremacism. Queer women, women of color are going to get more attacks, other people of color and queer people. So what we at the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism really emphasize is that these are long-term cultural changes. And when we see things like QAnon or the Proud Boys focusing on local school boards, things like the attacks on critical race theory, which follows the playbook of attacks on comprehensive sexuality education, really focusing on generational change. And so a lot of our intervention points come in too late. We really need to be thinking about things like comprehensive sex education. There's a new lobbying C4 called Educate Us that works on comprehensive sex education as one of the areas where you can teach about consent, about humanizing other people, about empathy. And we have had for a couple of decades now these actually really harmful abstinence-only programs in many schools that teach gender stereotyping, that are anti-LGBT, that are in many ways anti-consent, have a lot of problems. We can look at the literary canons we have, the lack of women's and girls' voices in what we teach in our English literary canons. One of our fellows, Erin Spompanato, has written about how you can see elements of misogynist incel ideology reflected in a lot of the traditional books that we read uncritically in elementary, middle, and high school history courses. So we really like to think about how we change the culture at that base level.
Yeah, that's great. Alex DiBranco, Executive Director of the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism, IRMS, THEIRMS.org, the website, Alex DiBranco on Twitter. Alex, thanks a lot for dropping by. Great meeting you. Great talking with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll be right back. It's 18 minutes past the hour.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
It's the place where we dare to ask, is Walmart a person? And we dare to say no. We'll be right back.